David, you and I have known one another for a very long time.
Since the early 70s.
I would say, well, I came to Brandeis in 1976.
Uh-huh.
So that means we've known one. I was aware of you before you were aware of me. I was thinking about I have my two earliest memories of you are memories that you won't share because it was me noticing you. And in one of them, I was a brand new graduate student. You were a senior graduate student. And in one of those memories is of you walking down the halls at Brandeis University, where we were both graduate students, or you had sort of moved on to the next phase, really. But I was a new graduate student, and you were reading Fuchs, Gradus ac Parnassum. And that's almost certainly why not too long after that, I bought my own copy of Fuchs and read it too, just from having seen you do that. And the other memory, it's not a profound memory, but it's a memory, and it's pertinent to this conversation, which is of walking into Schlossberg, again, a brand new place for me, sort of exciting and new. And there you were, you're back conducting the Brandeis Orchestra, Brandeis University Orchestra. So that's how I was aware of you as the senior person before we became musically entwined.
Yeah.
And
I'm sure I was reading Fuchs because I'd been asked to teach first year theory. And part of the curriculum was to teach, species counterpoint. And I thought, I better bone up on this, at least first and second species, and see what I can get out of it. So yeah, that's probably the reason. Yeah. I wish there were a more erudite reason for my having, tried to read Fuchs, but that's probably it.
I think it was. I think you were definitely teaching at that time. But it's a good idea to go back to the origins.
Yeah, I think one of the first memories I have of you is of your music, and that is of your duo for flute and percussion. That I think maybe it was Chris Kruger and Dean Anderson played at Brandeis. And I remember thinking, this is not a student piece. This is a fully formed composer. I don't know when you wrote that in terms of your studies. I think you must have written it at Brandeis, right?
I did. And I was studying with Marty Boykin at the time, but I had just come back from Tanglewood, where I had studied with Jake Druckmann. Mm-hmm. And one of the most important things that I learned from Jake Druckmann was the importance of, as a composer, of having a conception of the whole and not just composing pieces, by accumulating details, one after the other.
Was that a new concept to you?
The idea, well, it was a concept that certainly sort of impacted me immediately. He was very good at describing, you need to sketch. I kept bringing in this tiny little phrase, and then the next week I'd bring another phrase on top of that. And he said he did this wonderful illustrative thing, which was, he said, look, and I've done it many times since with students, the same thing. He said, if I was drawing a picture of you, Peter Child, right now, I wouldn't draw a nose and then a pair of glasses and then, I'd say, okay, there's Peter. He's sitting there with his head to one side and his arms are sort of akimbo, or maybe he's crossed his arms and, oh no, his head's really not like that. This is the thing that I most remember. That no, it's not, head's not like that. And its head's much more angled that way. And actually he's angled that way, but he's looking, in other words, he kind of illustrated this idea of sketching and getting a concept of the whole before dealing with the details, and probably tells us a lot about Jake's music, actually.
Yes.
But at the same time, I was very interested in 12-tone music. I was studying with Marty Boykin, who was of course, a 12-tone composer, I think, more or less all his career. And so these two concepts got combined in that piece. Process of sketching in the sense of sort of developing really a large scale concept of what the music was going to do in terms of pitch, and then figuring out how to mold that raw material into specific shapes.
What year did you write the duo?
So this was premiered, I was in Tanglewood in 78, and it was premiered in 79.
Okay, so I was looking back through your catalog in looking forward to this conversation. And I think there are 11 of your pieces that I've had some involvement with, either as a horn player in the Manuel Wind Quintet or as a conductor. And the first one, in terms of your music, was Ensemblance, a 1982 piece, and a piece that I think I suckered you into writing, called Tenoramente, for 4 low-pitched instruments. I don't know how I ever convinced you to do that. But among the pieces that I've had the enormous pleasure of conducting of yours are 2 commissioned works from cantata singers. And the first one, Estrella, was 1988.
Actually, it was earlier.
Sorry? It
was earlier than that. I was looking it up myself. I think it was more like maybe 1983 to 4 was the composition. I think the premiere was 84.
Oh, I guess you're right. Yes. And so
it happened very quickly in those days.
Yes. More than 30 years later, we commissioned you to write another piece for chorus and orchestra, which ended up a most beautiful piece, Lamentations. And they are both extremely gripping and emotionally challenging pieces of music, something that I prize, not that I had anything to do with it, but I prize the fact that of the 16 or so commissions that cantata singers supported during my music directorship, they were all very thoughtful and penetrating pieces. Yours really right up there at the highest level. And yet these pieces are more than 30 years apart in their creation. They sound both very much like you, but they are very different. And how do you account for, I think it's easy to understand the discrepancy between that piece from the mid 80s and the piece in 2018. I understand we would hope that they would be different. But how is it that they both sound like you and no one else?
First of all, you're just opening this door for, I have to remind you of an anecdote that if you don't remember it now, I'm sure you knew it at one time, which was somebody once asked Stravinsky, what's the difference between the Rite of Spring and the Symphony of Psalms? Yeah. And his answer was 30 years. So I can speculate about that with certainly a perspective that will be different from somebody else's. And I don't claim authority in many things, but maybe I can speculate about why a piece from 30 years ago would resonate with a piece, 30 years later that is on the surface quite different. And I think it has to do with the fact that all of that music, going back even to the more sort of juvenile pieces, and certainly to the music that I write today, it comes from a sensibility that probably was formed at a very young age in me, and that manifested itself at different periods in different ways, due to, for different reasons. So in 1983, going back to your question about the Flute and Percussion Duo, I was still very much in that sort of modernist frame of mind. Mm-hmm. I was no longer writing 12-tone music, but the language was still kind of committed. I was letting go of the principles of organizing music according to a non-tonal frame of reference, only very, very reluctantly. Occasionally I would write pieces on a whim that were very, just completely freely composed and tonal, but for the most part, I was still committed to that kind of principle. For whatever reason, those of us of our generation were doing that. I was doing it.
Yes.
But by the time Lamentations came around, by 30 years later, I had experimented, as you know, because you've conducted many of these pieces, with a much broader palette of harmonic possibility. And I don't think that there was ever a point in which I rejected what I had done before. And there was certainly never a point in which I said, okay, those resources are no longer accessible to me. I'm not interested in them. I can't use them anymore. But I would allow myself to, I would allow myself to use other resources, or I would actually consciously expand my resources, And, but the sensibility itself, the source of it, whilst it's raw at some point, and hopefully, if not mature, at least more mature at a later point, that fundament, that personality, that core, actually, I think is very similar, more or less the same, insofar as we're ever the same after 30 years.
I think people might be surprised if they saw a score of Estrella, and I have one with me, and if they compared it to just a page of the score from Lamentations, without looking at in any detail and allowing for the fact that they look very different, because the vocal score of Estrella is still in your very beautiful manuscript, and the score of Lamentations is engraved, so to speak. And so they look very different, but if you just glance at a page of it, you can see how different the fabric of the music is. I'm going to just hold up a page here and hope that I can hold it up nicely enough so that somebody could see it and take it in. This is from Estrella from the mid-1980s. And you can see the rather more contrapuntal relationship of the lines. And certainly if you look even a little more close, you see how chromatic the music is. It's not non-tonal, but it is definitely chromatic. And when we compare that quickly to a page from Lamentations, and this particular page is homophonic, which is not to say you didn't write homophonic music before. It is diatonic completely, which is not to say this entire piece is diatonic, but there are real surface differences between these pieces. Yeah. And I think that anyone who listened to the entire array of rich music that you've composed would hear what I think they would hear what I hear, and that is that although they are quite different, the earlier music and the later music, they really sound like no one but you. And so I'm wondering what that early sensibility is that you spoke of. Yeah. You think was instilled, that you think is a kind of maybe a through line to all of your music.
Well, I mean, it goes back quite a long way. And it's hard for me to be very specific, but I don't know if you knew this, David, but I started taking composition lessons when I was 12 and 13.
I didn't.
With a composer who was an English composer in Suffolk. His name is Bernard Barrow. Completely indebted to him. You can imagine at that young age to learn. And for him, teaching composition was mostly teaching harmony and counterpoint, tonal harmony, counterpoint, in Bach chorale style, harmony and counterpoint. And he would give me these exercises. He would mimeograph, his definitions of passing tones and harmonies, so on and so forth. Pardon?
You could still smell the mimeograph.
Yes, exactly. And I would go home and do that. And then I would write my pieces, whatever those pieces were, and bring them in and show him. And he would look at them and he would say nice things. And he'd say, yes, I think we can see. I mean, he was a great believer in technique, founding compositional technique in harmony and counterpoint practice and technique, that sense of technique. And he would say, yes, I think we can see the effect of, of your studies in harmony and counterpoint. I can't with this amount of time, water that's passed under the bridge, remember exactly how he said it. But he would be complimentary, but he wouldn't say very much about those pieces. But I would listen to his music. I would listen to a lot of Britain. I was in Suffolk. Britain was not very far away. He was in Aldeburgh. Benjamin Britten actually came to my primary school while I was living there. And we had learned a few of those simple songs, those rounds that he wrote and for him. And that was, it was kind of a tradition. My composition teacher was one of those who practiced composition for children and amateurs. And there were several of them. There's a composer called Gordon Cross, who wrote a lot of music for children, and much more avant-garde style music, but which I played with my school orchestras. And then there was Britten himself. And it was that was the music that was in the air. So I think if any of those pieces survived, I mean, I can think of one piece that was a little piano piece, and it was called In F, I-N-E-F, In F, because it was somehow centered on F, and it was all in fourths and fifths. It's a sort of clangorous, lively piece, but diatonic and modal. So those are the things that kind of shaped my sensibility. As I think I wasn't raised in a very musical family. There was not a lot of music in my house. There certainly wasn't very much in the way of classical music in my house. So what I learned, but I also wasn't that interested in popular music either, particularly when I should have been, when the Beatles were kind of in the beginning of their careers. And I perhaps have been paying a lot more attention to what was going on in popular music than I did, but I wasn't. But I was paying attention to is the music that I was playing, that my teacher was giving me, and anything that was modern, shaped what I wanted to do in my composition. So I think that's the source of it. So that sort of diatonic sort of orientation, I know that's a bit of a default in a way, if you dig deep enough.
So I'm curious, you say you came from a family that was not particularly musical. I always have believed that that the sources of music making, especially of somebody who wants to play the violin or the piano or something like that, that the first influence is a social one.
Yeah.
That is, your grandmother played the piano and you used to lie under the piano when she played the piano, or the kid down the block plays the clarinet, so maybe I should play the clarinet, or I should at least play an instrument. But how does someone at age 12 decide that he wants to mess around with writing music?
Yeah.
That's not a social endeavor.
Right. Yeah. Well, I think it's typical, as is typical of you, if I may say so. You've sort of put your finger on a very good and interesting question that I frankly had never thought of before. I started the violin when I was 8, and I did it because I was curious. I mean, I was a joiner. I joined a lot of things, and violin lessons were being offered in my public school, and there they were, as I was 8 years old, and I could have a violin and I could play it, learn how to play it. And then piano lessons when I was 9. I was interested enough to know that I wanted to do it, but you're right, it did not come from a social wanting to be part of something that I knew already existed and I felt I needed to belong to. It was for me a kind of a little bit of I think maybe it was a bit solitary. And it did sort of, I think my parents were very supportive. It took some effort on their part to make this happen, all of, these lessons, and especially the composition lessons, because I had to be driven some distance in order to have these lessons. So they were supportive in that way, but I think it was for me a kind of a solitary place. And, something I withdrew into, and that might be why I oriented towards composition quite quickly. The reason I had composition lessons, the reason that happened is I wrote a piece of music and I took it to my piano teacher and showed it to her. And she told my father I have to have composition lessons. And figured that out for me, who to go to and all of that. She knew. So I was lucky. I was extremely lucky. I was extremely lucky.
From a family that was not, that you don't think of as musical per se.
Right.
They got something that was crucial to you, or
yes,
could be crucial to you,
and they were willing to support it. And then the other piece was that the schools were very, they had the resources. They were making these things possible for people. And so somebody like me comes into this very sort of, in this very kind of, I would say, rural backwaters sort of part of England, but there's not a lot going on in the town or it's a very, especially in those days, it was rather a remote part of England, the east coast of England. And possibilities were opened up for me through the schools. So it's kind of a telling, there's a moral there.
Well, the moral is very clear. And it should not be lost on anyone, the value of music in the schools and musical literacy in the schools, and just the opportunity for young people to have contact with some of the greatest artistic minds that humanity have ever come into humanity. May I ask you something about your thinking when you are composing? Composing for string quartets or for orchestras or for choruses or solo voice, for some composers are very different affairs. An exception to that would be Bach, who sort of seemed to ignore the distinctions between singers and keyboard players and cellists, except for the fact that the instrumentalists could play faster than the singers could sing. But he expected the same musical sophistication in terms of their hearing, in terms of their ability to sing often very chromatic music and gnarly music. Even the boys. Somebody who I think was very different was Haydn, who I think of as composing in one way for a chorus, and in a different way, a more complex way, for an orchestra, and in an even more complex way, at least emotionally, in terms of musical sophistication, for, say, a string quartet. He asks different things of those groups of people, and he asks different things of their audience. And so I'm wondering where you imagine your music fits into these maybe two extremes, where the process of writing for voice, which, and you've written a number of choral pieces, not just the two works for cantata singers, how different you approach the medium, especially when that medium, the chorus, is with the orchestra, an orchestra whose technical ease may be different than the choruses. Is there a fundamental difference? Is it all very similar for you? Is it intuitive? What?
Yeah. Well, I mean, one of the things that's obviously true is that the conditions that are going to affect how I or you or anybody writes for chorus and orchestra, either separately or together, are going to vary a lot from moment to moment, according to the context. There are constraints, right? I mean, sometimes I will make the judgment, rightly or wrongly, that the chorus needs a certain amount of support in this particular for this music or in this passage, and less support, less immediate support in the sense of doubling in that passage. The coloristic possibilities of the orchestra can enhance or alter the kind of emotional trajectory of the music in important ways. But if one's desire as a composer is to say, okay, I want the chorus doing this and I want the orchestra doing something completely different, and let everybody sort of sort out what that means, and you put these two things together, that might be at odds of what's actually possible for a chorus to really do. And so I think and then you have to sort of factor in the actual the rate at which I or any composer develops in terms of their ability to really master and really imagine what it means to write both idiomatically but also challengingly for this instrument and that instrument, and then that combination of instrument, which I think is a lifetime. I think a single lifetime isn't enough time for me, really, to learn everything that's possible to do in that domain. But it's all of these things together. But when I write a piece for you that I know you're going to conduct, I simply assume that we'll work some things out in rehearsal, by which I mean not that I sort of abrogate responsibility, but I'll try something, I'll calculate something on the assumption that through our interaction, if it's good, it's good, but if it needs work, if it needs to be tweaked, that's something we'll work out together.
Well, that's very generous.
Not because I say to you, by the way, David, I'm expecting you to do that, but because from all these years of working with you, I know that that's likely to happen, and it's very much to my benefit and also to the benefit of the piece. So it really depends on context. Some conductors won't get involved in that way. They'll just say, this doesn't work, or.
Well, your observation of our work together is very generous, but I can't help but think that there are times in the process when you get nervous. You've spoken to me about being nervous when you're actually writing the piece, especially in early stages of when you're plagued by doubts. But I would assume that that's very normal for every composer. I certainly have experienced that. But in the process of rehearsals, you also must get nervous. And is it, oh my gosh, they'll never be able to do this? Or even if they are able to do this, is the piece what it should be, what I'd like it to be? When are you most nervous, and when do you begin to relax in the process?
Again, it really varies. But the question, if I hear something that is just simply not working, the question is always going to be, is it my miscalculation and is the score that needs to be fixed, or has the rehearsal process not yet brought it to where it can be? And is it, a very good example would be when musicians, sometimes the conductor, and I don't mean you, but another conductor, might be hearing the pulse in 4 when it should be heard in 2. Something as simple as that, can affect the way the music can transform the way the music sounds, from something that sounds clunky and not at all what I meant to something that sounds just right. And then it's about the musicians just simply getting to know the piece and sort of growing into the piece. But if the piece demands a kind of unidiomatic, fingering and bowing, combination of fingering and bowing that just simply will never sound graceful, then, I mean, I'm making this up because that's not an actual example that I can remember, but that's a situation where I would very seriously want to think about revising the piece. But I think this is a treacherous world for composers, because it's that line between being overly cautious and overly idiomatic and constraining the imaginative reach of the music that you're writing, and on the other hand, giving free rein to the imaginative reach that you're writing, and ending up writing a piece that can only be performed by a very small handful of musicians, if that. And I think it's just a line that we walk, and we have to adjust the balance constantly throughout our lives and for different groups and different situations. I think it's just a constant period of actually learning, but also adjustment for me.
Yeah. Have you ever, in the midst of a rehearsal process, made wholesale changes in a piece?
Wholesale changes, I can't think of wholesale changes, but I've certainly, as you know perfectly well, because you were part of it, I've reorchestrated. Mm-hmm. And I'd have to think about, no, not wholesale changes. The whole, so where errors used to come in much more than they do now have to do with proportions and pacing. So I have at least twice composed pieces in which a whole section of music, after the first performance, it was evident to me that it was too short. And I had to simply write more music. I had to develop it. It wasn't developing its ideas adequately, and it wasn't proportionately right for the rest of the piece. This is a while ago now. It's not a recent experience. So, but that kind of thing can happen. I personally found that I have sometimes not really fully appreciated, what the proportionate weight of what I've done is relative to what comes afterwards. And then I've had to make wholesale changes, but I wouldn't try to do that in rehearsal. I mean, there's so few rehearsals.
Yeah.
Usually. No,
you have to let it play out.
Yeah.
Through the rehearsal process, because as you say, you don't know whether it's you or them. And
that's right.
And so when you're at that first performance, you show up to the concert, what are your thoughts and feelings before the fact? The concert begins and yours is the third piece on the program and whatever. And are you taking in your piece in any way like you just took in the first two pieces of the program that were not by you?
No, I don't think so. I think, for one thing,
are you taking in the first two pieces?
Well, not as well as I would like, not as well as I would if I didn't have a piece on the program.
Yeah.
Not by any means. But again, it varies a lot. But no, I think with my own pieces, I'm really focusing in on the details. And it's extraordinary.
Details.
On much more of the moment to moment and less on just the way I would listen to a piece. How does this piece go? How does it shape? How are we getting from here to there? How surprising, is that interruption, or those kinds of feelings, the big feelings. I think with my piece, I'm much more so you and I just had the experience of bringing Turning Point into its first iteration. And there I was on the edge of my seat because it's so fast and it's so, there are so many different ways in which you could conceivably go wrong. I mean, if the musicians got off by half a measure, how do you get back on again?
Right.
The opportunity to play wrong notes, especially depending on the instrument. There's so many opportunities to do that. I mean, I was very much I was also extremely excited. I could tell that it was working. I was in a really I was in a state of extreme concentration throughout that performance. We're talking about a piece that was just premiered, what, a month and a half ago, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, how problematic does a performance of your piece need to be for you to think it's not there? Nobody heard my piece.
Oh, very rare. Yes, it has happened, but not for many, many years. And it's a very, very, very disheartening experience and damaging and discouraging.
Yeah.
Because you still don't, because I was a different composer, I was a different person, but I wasn't sure how much of it was my fault.
Well, I mean, if they come apart,
Well, yes, but if it's not that, if it's more about just lack of comprehension or everything just sort of doesn't add up to a piece.
Yes.
But
if somebody plays an E flat that should have been an E natural in the scheme of a 10-minute piece or something, even though you're focusing on the details.
No, I mean, an odd
world has fallen apart.
No. I would very much worry if like I said, if somebody got off by a half a measure or a measure and stayed off for a while before, and then was trying to figure out, but no, an odd note. There's a very good chance I wouldn't hear it.
Yeah, which of course
there are plenty of times when musicians come up and apologize.
And you say, what happened?
Yeah, either I don't hear it or I really don't care because they made the piece go so well.
Right.
That's not what I know. That's what I will say. If I did hear it, I'll say, that's not what's important. And they if it was anybody else's music, if they weren't talking to the composer, they would know that too, I think, most of the time. But it really, really depends. So much. It changes so much. But can I ask you a few questions?
Sure.
Turn it around a little bit, because you have now started. When I first knew you, you actually had been at Brandeis University, where we both went studying composition. And you also were a prominent and fantastic horn player. You were playing, I don't know whether the Emmanuel Quintet had been formed back then or whether that came a little bit later.
Probably a little bit later.
A little bit later, but it went on.
While I was teaching at Brandeis, yes.
Yeah. It was very, it was very shortly after that. But you were primarily in your earliest experiences, your earliest days, a horn player and a composer. But when I met you, you were beginning to transition into conducting, I would say.
Yeah.
And
that sort of, it went like this, and then they got to this point, where the horn playing and the conducting were quivering, and then it just sort of fell over on the other side of the fence.
So I have a question that I'm interested in, but I think also people who are listening to this might also be interested in, is how do you feel, if it's a good question, if it's a relevant question, that your training as a composer and as a horn player and your experience as a performer fed into and informed your development as a conductor?
Well, I definitely think my training as a composer had enormous, and continues to have enormous impact on the way I think about music, which in turn has enormous impact on conducting. Sometimes I have the sense that conductors are what I would call event conductors. Oh, the trombones enter in bar 64 on the third beat, and then 3 bars later, I have to cue the cymbals and the violins, and which is not to belittle that, but that seems so not the point. And I think what what I spend most of my time doing when I'm studying somebody else's music is trying to figure out why it works. What is it that makes this music work? What makes it breathe? What makes it move? And how that in turn informs the whole performing process. Where's the weight? Where's the release? Where's the motion forward? But that has to start with trying to figure out, as best one can, why the piece is doing what it's doing, and why this harmony might connect with this one in an unexpected way, or just noticing things in the music. And a lot of that came from working with Seymour Schifrin and Marty Boykin at Brandeis, people at Oberlin when I was an undergrad. And
also composers, your composition teachers at Oberlin. Yeah.
And so I'm endlessly fascinated, not by what's happening in the piece, that of course is interesting, but why is that happening in the piece? And I may be making it up in my head, but at least I want to have some notion of why something is happening. And maybe even say in the case of your music, what is it that motivated that musical decision? Why are these lines which are moving in conjunction, like schools of fish, like in the piece for collage, at the beginning, what's making the harmony, which is going lickety-split, work? And where did it come from? I mean, what was the thinking that brought that about? Or in the case of music that is chromatic but tonal, and that's a ton of music, from Wagner and Elgar, to a lot of music today. What is the memory in that composer's hearing that he or she is working against or with? And what are our expectations as a listener at every moment? Do we expect the next harmony? Do we expect that harmony? And those expectations come from what preceded it. And of course, surprises happen in Beethoven and Haydn and Bach, all manner of earlier tonal composers, but the surprises happen in much later music that is also tonal. And I'm curious as to how the ear is working to assimilate those sometimes those often unexpected harmonies. And I think or musical lines, I think I often try to hear what it might have been if it had been written by, a Kapellmeister von Strudelhofer. And that's really often the case with, say, Haydn and Mozart, where the language is very much like other composers of that era. That is the harmonic, the gestures and the clear rhythmic structure and all of that. But there is an essential difference, and it has to do with how the music breathes and moves in much more inventive and coherent ways than a lot of other composers' music does. Doesn't mean the other music's not worth hearing. It just there is a qualitative difference. And what is it that makes, what is the memory and what is the expectation? I think that is really what I'm constantly asking when I'm looking at somebody else's music, whether it's old music or your music. And I think the horn player part of me, which is long gone now, also has to do with how music breathes and what the challenges are for the instrumentalist or the singer. As you know, I began composing again during the pandemic, and collage actually ended up performing a piece of mine. And I realized after the first rehearsal, after the reading in the first rehearsal of my piece, that I had totally misgauged its difficulty. And I apologized to the players because I said, you know, I can look at almost any piece, or even a long piece, and a piece that's by a composer whose music I don't know, and I can tell you within 5 minutes how difficult it will be just to put it together. I don't even mean to understand it. I mean to put the thing together. Oh, we need 5 rehearsals for that, and I can't put this other piece with it because it's going to take up too much time, whatever. And I said, I completely proved that I'm incapable of doing it with my own music. And I think that's actually largely lack of experience and being too close to it myself. I couldn't separate myself from the music enough to accept the fact that I could hear it and I could imagine it, that it wouldn't necessarily be possible. Now that skill is something that I trust would come if I were to continue composing again and had more experience. And it is something that, you know, we're making reference to when we're talking about your music. And that is that you do have great experience and ability to assess in advance what 98% of the difficulties are going to be. And your piece is not written down to those challenges, but actually just meets them where they need to be met.
But what about the possibility in the case of your piece, which was called First Pass, that, I mean, what do you think about the second performance of that piece, when the second performance happens, either conducted by you or by somebody else, and then the third performance? Are the things that seem unreasonably difficult going to seem less?
I think there were things that were needlessly difficult. I mean, we both know extremely complex music. Let's just say Pierre Boulez, for instance, or Karl-Heinz Stockhausen, you know, the earlier music that was notated and had pitches. And that music strikes me as having to be that difficult because of its aesthetic. But the aesthetic of this little piece that I wrote was not such that it had to be that difficult. And it was therefore harder than it needed to be. And when I was working with these first class, extremely experienced musicians who play new music all the time, and music that in certain respects could be more difficult than this piece I wrote. These 4 measures were just never got quite right. And those 6 measures were terrifying. I think, and it didn't need to be that difficult. Then I think the responsibility was on me as the composer.
But if you had,
that's not to say it couldn't be done. But the question is, what's reasonable
Yes.
given
Yeah.
the...
It's all proportionate to the, to what it is you're trying to achieve with the music. And actually, one of the things that you don't talk about in that piece is that sort of emotional trajectory, because it has one. It has a rather, to my mind, rather affecting one, rather a profound one, and it ends on a note of solace.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's consoling. It's a very consoling piece. And I assume that the difficulties, the challenges that, you know, that had to be overcome in that piece are not mostly in the area concentrated towards the end, where the music takes on a kind of broad chorale-like
correct
feeling. But in the lead up to it, but is there something about the way you lead up to that makes that ending as powerful as it is? And I wonder
but I think all of that could have been achieved not by wholesale rewriting of the piece, but rather just asking slightly less of the players all the time. It was interesting. John Harbison said about it afterwards that for a piece with 7 instruments, it sounded like an orchestra piece. And I think it's partly because it was sort of the Robert Schumann idea, keep everybody busy, you know.
Lots and lots of doublings and octave doublings.
A lot of doublings and things that just were, that made it quite challenging to coordinate and to make sense. So after that performance, I went back and I don't know if the piece will ever get played again, but I just tried to clean it up. And
so all of those obstacles you think you took out of the piece?
I think I took some of the obstacles out. And I don't think the piece will sound anything but better for it.
Yeah.
I hope.
I have to say, by the way, this is not apropos of your piece, but it is astonishing to me how often when I have to fix something, either because I don't think that it makes a reasonable expectation of the player or because I made a damn mistake, which happens, obviously, that the result is an improvement. This is very much a footnote to what you're saying, because what you're saying is much more important, but it's quite astonishing how often that happens. So, for example, the piece of mine that you just premiered, I wanted a 5-octave marimba. Those in charge of the purse strings tried to urge me to think, do I really need a 5-octave marimba? And I revised it, as you now know, because you saw the finished score with an ossia there for a 4.5-octave marimba. And I actually think that version's better. I think the reasons for the 5-octave marimba were good, but the revision actually is better. Now and that kind of thing happens quite a lot, actually. And so it may well be, you know, that something like that will happen with first pass. Though I kind of wondering whether you approached the conducting of your own piece differently from the way that you might have approached the conducting of somebody else's piece, where, as you said, you're interested in somebody else's piece, understanding how does this connect to that, how does this set up that, or how does this contradict with what came, and so on and so forth. Do you think it's possible really to do that with your own music?
Perhaps
because you already know how those
there are
things
certainly
go.
people who, you know, conduct their own music very successfully, you know, Igor Stravinsky and John Harbison, for instance, you know, pick 2 very different examples. And it would be interesting to ask John what he thinks when he's conducting his own music as opposed to listening to somebody else conduct it. But I think you did put your finger on one thing, and that is that when the difficulties arose in my piece and I had to stop and spend what at that moment felt like inordinate time to get these details right in these 3 measures of very rapid music, I felt like this is indulgent. I can't do this. I've got 4 other pieces on this program I have to take care of, and taking care of those is more important than my getting these two measures
Yeah.
right in my piece. So
There's a
there is a
psychological
certain sort of self-effacing,
yeah.
embarrassment or something that comes from that. But I still do think, even if I step outside of that, I think there are ways in which the piece will be better for not having a 5-octave marimba. Peter,
Yes.
this has been great, most fascinating, and I just want to.
Do you have a little bit more time? Because I did want to say one or two more things, but if you feel
Sure.
well, I just wanted to say I want to say that what you described about your composition, about your conducting process, I mean, was really interesting to me. It was because I don't think I've ever heard you talk about it at all, really. But it was certainly not in that way. But it corresponds very much to what it is I think I'm hearing when I hear you conduct, because I feel that I hear music. I truly think I hear music differently when you conduct it than I normally hear it. For me, when you present a concert, it's an event, and I have, as a result, listened to music that's familiar but in different ways, and I've opened my ears to music that I didn't know, or that I thought perhaps I wasn't interested in, and become interested in it because of the performances that I've heard with you, and particularly with the cantata singers, where you're doing repertory, and it's this very broad range of repertory, and including composers like Zelenka. I did never heard anything by Zelenka, but I'll never forget that performance that you gave of the Mass. Wasn't that long ago. And at the same time, and then another, I just was trying to make a list of and I'm not going to repeat them all to you, but the pieces that are like that for me, where my whole relationship to a composer or to a piece changed because of your performance, or where I learned a piece for the first time. The first performance of Sur Incise was your performance. And so there are many such experiences like that. And it really, I've tried to put my finger on it. It's because the way you're phrasing the music, you could say, put it in these, and of course it is about the way you're phrasing the music, but it also has to do with something deeper, the comprehension that you're projecting in the performance. But I do have one last question I have two questions I want to ask.
Well, that's very that observation is very generous. I appreciate it.
It's true though, David.
I don't. I had the experience over the last couple of years. I was scheduled to conduct a couple concerts in Taiwan, and then they got postponed because of COVID, and they got postponed again. And finally, I went to do them. But during those many months, I had a long time to spend with a piece that I had conducted a couple times before, the Elgar First Symphony, piece I really love. But I think I'd always learned it maybe a little too rapidly in the past. And many times I went back to the score and I would play parts of the piece extremely slowly to try to figure out what it was in his ear that made the harmony work. It clearly worked, but it was mysterious at the same time. And it wasn't just, oh, well, he's just writing chromatic music that uses a lot of, half diminished seventh chords, but it was how this phrase unfolded and what the consequence of that decision, what the consequences of that compositional decision were, and what if he had done something else. And that was a very important part of, that was a great gift to have however painful COVID has been, having the kind of time to do that with a piece of music that I already loved. But I have to also say, once you get to the rehearsals, I'm not thinking about that anymore. I hope it's just kind of embedded.
Yeah.
You know, you're thinking about, you know, getting the woodwinds to play in tune and getting it to phrase in an appropriate way, and
making sure the trombones come in on time. What you were talking about,
and occasionally making sure the trombones come in on time. Yes, but I do think it's that process that continues to fascinate me about music. The process of trying to, as best I can, imagine getting into your head. You know, imagine getting into your thinking. Now, I'm making it up, but at least it's a way of translating whatever you're doing into my way of thinking. And I hope it has more than academic influence on performances.
Well, it does on me, for whatever that's worth. And I don't think I'm alone in that at all. You know, if what I'm experiencing in your performances corresponds to what you're describing in the process that gets you then, because it's, you know, and I can tell you not just some of the pieces that I've heard, but that have had this lasting effect, but performances that I've missed that I've never gotten over missing your Mrs. Solemnis a few years ago. That really upsets me that I wasn't there, because I knew it was an important event. So my last question has to do, you're going to do a kind of a farewell concert with Cantata singers on June 11th.
Yes.
And I was looking at the program, which is so apt for our time that we're living in now, this dreadful period that we're living in, because of the conflicts all throughout the world, but most prominently to us at the moment, Ukraine. And so you're doing a performance of Donna Nobis Pacem with Vaughan Williams, and the Mass in Time of War by Haydn, and Farewell to Arms by Finzi. Was that program developed? Was it prescient? Is it because of the times that we're living in that you chose that particular collection of pieces, or was it the specific events that we're living through at the moment? Or,
well, unfortunately, in our day and age, almost any time is appropriate for a program that looks at the issues related to war and peace. And the fact that it is so appropriate right now is actually somewhat accidental. And that is that this program was originally planned to be my final concert with Cantata singers, which was to be, 2 years ago?
Yes, at least 2 years ago, yeah.
And at the end and it was the last of what turned out to be 6 canceled concerts, 2 from the 1819 season and the entirety of the 1920 season. And it was there because I thought the pieces spoke to each other. I made that program because I thought the pieces spoke to each other musically and obviously emotionally. And of course, now it's very current and in all of our minds and hearts. I don't think music is there to necessarily to answer our questions. I don't think it's there, at least certainly not classical music. I don't think it's there to answer our questions. I don't think it's there to solve our problems. I don't think it's there to even address the big issues of the day. You know, you might think, Missa Solemnis or St. Matthew Passion or B minor Mass of Bach, don't those pieces address the big issues of their day or of all time? Yes, maybe they do, but I don't think it's classical music's purpose. And I don't actually think it's strength, because the way classical music can grapple with, say, the issue of war and peace in the form of the Britain War Requiem or these three works that are on this concert, is indirect and metaphoric and elusive. And really the way those issues have to be addressed is by voting. Wilfred Owen, the great British poet, who was killed in the last week of the First World War, of the so-called Great War, apparently almost to the hour, 7 days before the armistice was signed, said, "All that a poet can do is warn." And that's what these pieces do, but they aren't, I don't think it is the purpose of classical music to warn, or poetry to warn for that matter, only. I think the strength and richness of that whole array of music, from Josquin to Schütz and Bach and Mozart and Brahms and Stravinsky and Schoenberg and Child, is to confront us with sustained, concentrated thought. I think that's what music is about. There are very few activities in our lives that demand that of us. And especially today, we're easily distracted by so many things. But if you go to a concert, and I mean a classical music concert, I don't mean a rock concert, I mean a classical music concert, the expectation, and I think it is a reasonable expectation, is that you will go and you will sit, and that piece will begin, and it will either be 7 minutes long, in the case of, say, the longest Anton Webern piece, or it will be hours and hours long in the case of that Wagner opera. And the expectation is that you will in some way stay engaged with the thought process that starts at the beginning and works its way to the end in whatever way it does, successfully or unsuccessfully. I think that is classical music's richness. And it is best experienced in the concert hall. It's not useless when you're listening to a recording at all, but it's very easy to get up and say, I need to go get something to eat. So it's easy to be distracted from that. And the hope and expectation of your engagement with somebody else's thinking, and in a certain sense, abstract thinking, because it's not words, even though there may be words in the concert. If it's sung music, there will be words, but with the musical thought that makes an arch from the beginning to the end. Or in the case of a concert that perhaps begins with Farewell to Arms of Gerald Finzi and makes its way through Haydn Mass and Time of War to the end of Vaughan Williams' Dona Nobis Pacem. I think that is its strength. That is its gift. It is also its need, because it needs our concentration. It needs our, as best we can as human beings, it needs us to give it our undivided attention. Maybe just for that 35 minutes. And then we go about our day. So I think these three pieces on this particular cantata singers concert ask those of us. They also speak to the issue of war. And I think it is the interaction of those two things that the specific and the metaphoric that will make the experience for the listener and probably the performers extend far beyond the 35 minutes that piece or the hour and a half that concert might take, and that it spins out and out and out and out and larger and larger. And so, yes, all that a poet can do is warn, but the richness of that warning, whether it's topical or it's not topical, is of infinite interest, and for me, infinite importance.
Exceptionally beautifully said, David. Extremely thoughtful. I'm just going to ruin it by saying anything.
No, it's great to talk. It's always great to talk with you.
Yeah, yes, it is. Good. You'll talk.
We're just chatting about, our family lives, or chatting about coffee, or talking about things that are so important to us. Talking with you is one of the most engaging and rewarding experiences I've ever had.
Likewise. Thank you.
So thank you for all of this time.
It was very rewarding.
Thank you for your music. It is a great gift to us. And I want to know, what are you working on now?
At the moment, I wrote a little tribute to our colleague, John Harbison.
Because he's retiring from the
Because of his retirement, yeah.
What is this for?
It's actually open instrumentation. It's called For Haiku. And because of his love of canons, each one has a canon, a crab canon, a retrograde canon, different, four different, very single phrase pieces, very Webern-like in that way. So that's what I did after Turning Point. And I was glad to have that, opportunity to use up some of the residual energy I had after Turning Point got done. But now I'm just waiting for the next opportunity to come along.
It will.
I hope.
And we will all look forward to hearing it.
Thank you, David. And I look forward to June 11th. I'll see you there, if not before.
Lots of love. Bye-bye.
Bye, David. Bye.